the necessitarian, is in reality only talking about constant conjunctions. That's all he can logically affirm. Regularity. There may be some constant conjunction between will and action, between what you decide and what you do, but you don't know any causal connection. So the necessitarian really is not affirming necessity, but only regularity. Now, by the same token, the libertarian, who asserts freedom of the will, the libertarian is trying to deny that there is causal necessity. Well, that's fine, because nobody can really assert it. But the libertarian is perfectly happy to say that there is regularity and constant conjunction between acts of will and what you do. So what's the quarrel between the two? Well, the only dispute, you see, is whether you call causation necessity or uniformity. It's a semantical debate about the meaning of the word causation. Well, I don't think that's ever terminated the debate. And I suppose Hume would say because people are induced to believe things by certain habits. Now, in the treatise, he comes at the question of free will in a little bit different way. If you want to look this up, it's in Book 3, Part 1. The term will refers simply to an impression which I feel when I give rise to some new physical movement or some new mental perception. In other words, when I decide I'm going to, when I decide I'm going to walk around to here, I'm aware of a certain impression, you see, in the chain of conscious events. An impression that moving around is the thing I'm going to do. But it's merely an impression, a feeling that's involved in the stream of conscious events. And similarly, when I stop to think of, say, what my wife might decide to make for dinner tonight, and I'm initiating a chain of thought, well, there is again a feeling, an impression of, I'm going to start thinking about this. You see? So there is nothing more to will than a kind of impression of starting something going in the mind or in overt action. Now, there's uniformity enough between that impression of what we call will and the resultant change or action to make us think that it really causes something to happen. And because we're not aware of antecedent causes of that impression, we think that act of will is free. Because we're not aware of any uniform causes. Of course, it may be that I get a certain feeling in the pit of my stomach in the late afternoon, which comes in constant conjunction with starting to think about what's for dinner, you see. But causal connection? No, I'm not aware of any, and so I think it's free. are in the way humans behave. Constant conjunctions between motive and action. Characteristic general ways in which adolescents behave. And the same with human beings generally. There's a predictability about the characteristic behaviors, actions, ways of thinking at different age levels, he says. And I'm curious because he wrote that when he was still in his 20s. He was pretty observant. You see, he didn't have books on developmental psychology to refer to. But the uniformities he finds everywhere. We only think that the will is free because we experience no antecedent force. All we actually experience is a spontaneous kind of impression. We don't experience indifference between alternatives that we weigh and then decide. No, what we experience normally is a spontaneous initiative. And that uniformity of things is what normally incites belief in necessity. In any case, the uniformities of human behavior can appropriately be extended to this aspect of human behavior, so there is much more reason to believe in determinism than there is to believe in indeterminism. And he turns out as a soft determinist. All we know is constant conjunctions, though it seems natural, and natural is the word he likes, in the course of nature. It seems a natural outcome of those constant conjunctions that we believe in necessity. So that's his other thing. In book 3 of the, did I say book 3? Yeah, in the treatise, he deals at great length with emotions and passions. And his point is that the will is guided, governed apparently, but guided by passion, emotion, not by reason. Now, traditional views of free will have said, yes, the will can be guided by reason. You remember Descartes, if we refrain from affirming until we know enough, you see. So that freedom of the will is tied to the assertion that the will is free enough to be guided by reason. Now, Hume rejects that quite plainly. Reason does not provide moral direction. Reason does not direct the will. It's the passions that direct the will. You see? It's the passions that direct the will. So when we get to his ethics, this discussion of freedom of the will becomes crucial in how he's going to develop his moral theory. Okay, any comment there? We talked about mind last time. You remember in illustrating what he's doing. Mind, it turns out, is nothing but a succession of ideas, nothing but a bundle of perceptions, appearing and disappearing, as on a theatre stage. You recall? We have no knowledge of any other basis for personal identity. And that obviously is going to affect his thinking about immortality. The traditional view of immortality in his day, thanks to Descartes, was that if the mind, the soul, is an immaterial substance, an entity that is independent and functions independently of the body, then it's capable of existing independently of the body. And so immortality is logically possible. Not so Hume, because he doesn't think that way about mind. He has an essay that was published in 1770, though apparently it was written earlier, an essay on the immortality of the soul, in which he takes this up. He says at the outset that by the mere light of reason, it's difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. The arguments are commonly derived either from metaphysical topics or moral topics, or from the physical nature of things. And then he goes on to discuss the arguments. But he says, in reality, it is the gospel and the gospel alone that has brought life and immortality to light. And of course, the Hume scholars think that may be tongue-in-cheek, inasmuch as his own belief is something religious belief is something he never aired, ventilated, even on his deathbed. At the end of the essay, he says, nothing could set in fuller light the infinite obligation which mankind has to divine revelation, since we find that no other medium could ascertain this great and important truth, immortality of the soul. Well, what does he say about the arguments? Well, the metaphysical argument is from the concept of substance. And you know what he thinks about the concept of substance. There's no logical basis for it. There is nothing in impressions and simple ideas that can give rise to the concept of something I know not what. So it's a confused idea. And so there can be no a priori reasoning related to that concept. No causal arguments related to the concept. The moral argument for immortality, namely that goodness, moral goodness in this life, will of necessity be rewarded in a life hereafter, implies the goodness of God, attributes of God that empirically are unknown. We have no matters of fact knowledge about God's attributes by empirical means. And so there is no logical possibility of a moral argument for the existence of God by purely philosophical means. And the argument from the physical world is usually an argument by analogy, namely that as the body goes to sleep and wakes up,